The handcuffs clicked in the bright light of a small police room. Men in plain clothes had watched him for a long time. For 40 years, people had been afraid. Then, one ordinary morning, officers walked up to a quiet house, knocked on the door, and the door opened. The man who lived there looked like any neighbor. He mowed his lawn, fixed things, and drove a small car. He answered the door and said nothing at first. When the officers placed his hands behind his back, the feeling in the room changed. For decades, he had hidden from the law. Now, the hiding was over. That moment, the arrest, was the loudest part of the story. It was a part everyone remembers because it answered the question on many minds. How could a person who caused so much fear live a normal life for so long? It was a point where the long, quiet terror met a single loud end. But to truly understand why that morning mattered, we need to go back to the nights when the very first crimes happened and when the first notes and hints began to frighten entire neighborhoods. It all started with doors left open and cars seen late at night. In the 1970s and early 1980s, families in towns across California woke to find their homes changed. Some people had been tied up and their houses searched. In other times, a person in a parked car was attacked while they sat inside. Many of these events happened at night when people thought they were safe at home. The attacks were quick and sudden. The person who did them often left no clear trace. The police at first thought these were separate events. Then they noticed patterns. The time of night, the places, and the small ways the crimes happened showed a single person might be behind many of them. After a while, the person behind these crimes started to write letters. He would send messages to the police and to newspapers. In the letters, he used a name, sometimes original Night Stalker, sometimes East Area Rapist, and later people would call him the Golden State Killer. He wrote about what he had done. He told hints only the attacker could know. He wanted people to read about him. He wanted to frighten them. That made the case different. It was not just about stopping a person who hid in the night. It was also about someone who liked the attention and wanted to be known. The letters did more than scare people. They gave detectives something to study. The writer sometimes used the same words. He sometimes signed in the same way. He sent police postcards and notes that made promises and threats. He bragged about how he could not be caught. That made people angry and afraid. Mothers kept their children in. People locked doors and watched their porches. The writer had turned many quiet nights into fearful ones. Police worked hard. Detectives from many cities shared notes and compared lists. Officers looked at maps and connected places on a map with a red pen. They checked who lived where and when people had been seen. They took fingerprints and wrote down strange details. Sometimes they found only tiny things, a small footprint in the mud, a shoe print near a window, a scrap of cloth on a fence. They saved everything. The police knew the same person might strike again, so they tried to learn the pattern. At first, the crimes were mostly in empty places where people sat in their cars or walked near their homes. Then, the attacks grew bolder. The man broke into houses when people slept. He tied people up and took things. In some cases, he hurt people badly and left the scene. In other cases, he ran away quickly. The people who lived in the neighborhoods started to watch every car that passed. Small towns that used to feel safe now felt watched and tense. For the man who did these things, life outside was ordinary. He owned a small truck. He had jobs that included working as a helper, a mechanic, and a store worker. He had a family once. Neighbors saw him as quiet and polite. He joined clubs and did small tasks around the neighborhood. He kept his life neat. That was part of how he avoided being found. People did not suspect their friendly neighbor. He blended in. Sometimes the writer's letters made new headlines. Newspapers printed the notes because they were part of the story. That made the man feel bigger than a simple criminal. He liked being in the news. He liked watching the fear grow. But he also made mistakes. Once, he left a small stamp mark on an envelope that showed where the letter had been mailed. Once, he used words in a letter that suggested a certain way of talking. Small pieces of his life slipped into the case like crumbs on the floor. The case was long and hard. New police technology helped, little by little. Fingerprints and early DNA tests were not always possible in the 1970s. Labs could not do some things and that they could do later. But over the decades, science grew stronger. Computers could store more information. DNA testing became more advanced. Detectives saved old evidence, and years later, tests that were not possible in the 1970s could be done. That is one reason the case could be solved many years later. Careful officers had kept evidence, and new tools could check it. Over the years, people grew frustrated. Names were suggested. Suspects were checked. Some people were accused in newspapers but were later cleared. The public wanted answers, and the police wanted the same. Still, the man who had caused so much fear stayed out of reach. He had planned his life so well that even when detectives thought they were close, the proof was not strong enough. Families left notes on their doors asking for help. Vigils were held. As years passed, the fear mixed with anger and sadness. A long list of unsolved files grew thicker in police stations. Detectives who began the case retired. New detectives took up the work. The puzzle was passed from hand to hand like a hot coal. Some touched it and felt burned. Some kept working carefully until they could pass it on. Then one day, detectives had a new idea. They would use a kind of science that had grown stronger, DNA. Years before, investigators had found small pieces of DNA at some scenes and had saved them in evidence bags. These small places in a lab storage room held the traces of the man who had been in a house or car years before. Scientists now could test these tiny bits and compare them to many samples. But they still needed a way to match the DNA to a person. A new tool that helped solve cold cases was a genealogy database. This was a place where people who wanted to learn about their family could upload their DNA to find relatives. Detectives thought, if we could find a relative of the person who left DNA, maybe that would lead us to the person. It was like using small family clues to build a larger picture. The detectives who tried this were careful. They asked for legal permission, and they worked with scientists. They uploaded a DNA profile built from crime scene evidence, not the full DNA of a person, but the parts that could be compared to relatives. The database returned matches to faraway cousins and second cousins. From there, detectives made family trees, like pages in a big book with many branches. They followed those branches, checked names, and looked for people who matched the age and location of the suspect. It was slow, patient work, like following paths through a forest until you see a house. That search finally led to one small clue that stood out. A man who looked like someone on a list had lived in the right places and at the right times. He had jobs that matched the patterns. He had a history that fit some pieces. Detectives learned his name. They watched his house. They checked his cars. They looked at his work records. They wanted to be sure before they moved. When the day came to knock on his door, officers were careful. They wanted to be right. They had seen cases end badly when people rushed. They took their time. They put on plain clothes, walked quietly up the front steps, and knocked. The man opened the door. For 40 years his name had been whispered. Now the whispering stopped. The handcuffs closed. Even then, the story did not end. Arrests do not always mean everything is solved. Police still had to show the proof in court. They had to explain how the old DNA matched and how the family tree led to this man. Families of victims who had waited for answers for decades watched and listened. Some people cried. Some people felt relief. Some felt fresh sorrow. The town that had lived in fear for so long had to begin the slow work of healing. We stop here for Chapter 1, on that quiet knock and the sound of the handcuffs. The arrest was a sharp, extreme event that breaks a long silence. But the road to that moment was full of small nights, worried families, patient detectives, advances in science, and the steady keeping of old evidence. Chapter 2 will pick up after this moment and show how the investigation became a trial, how families reacted, and how the country tried to understand why one man taunted the police for 40 years, and what it means for all of us who value safety and justice. Tell me when you are ready for Chapter 2.